Hello?
Hello.
Hi,
Hello.
how are you guys?
Excellent.
Great.
It's working.
Yes, yes. For some reason, I can't see myself. Is that normal with two people?
I don't know. There may be a small window in the corner.
Uh-huh. Hold on. Okay. It doesn't matter.
We
You're
are
not,
you are
you're
you
not
are
doing this for,
visible to us.
yeah, you're not doing this for my looks, so it doesn't matter.
They don't hurt. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. So we appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. So obviously we've been emailing. I'm Nathaniel, and
I'm Jeremy
well,
Carroll.
Hi,
yes.
how are you?
Hi.
So yeah, so we thought we would just talk to you a little bit. We've got some sort of questions and talking points we might go through. So sort of the next 40 minutes or so,
Sure.
both to kind of sort of ask you about your project itself, but also kind of as we've been doing with these chats, sort of pick your brain about directions you think we might go, things you think we should be considering or looking at as we sort of get on this project. So I guess a first place to start, sort of what got you into sort of undertaking the investigation that you did in your book on the Sublime Dreams of Living Machines.
Yes. My area of interest is in European history in the 18th and 19th century, in particular intellectual history. And for me, what that is a pursuit of a history of ideas as it goes through different periods, and the significance of not only why in that given historical period that idea came out, but also how it influenced the culture at large, and how it changed thought. And at some point, I think I came onto this notion that one of the most fascinating ideas that's embedded in modern Western culture, and which is something I became absolutely obsessed with, is the notion of thinking of human beings as machines. I mean, really, any living being as a machine, sometimes as an analog, but sometimes in a literal manner, and so on. I mean, but to me, what's really fascinating about that idea, which is something that a lot of people are used to now, is that it's both celebratory and also nightmarish for other people, right? And there's this great ambivalence toward it that goes back and forth. I mean, the introduction to my book, I point out how oftentimes, when somebody's praised, it says machines, right? Like Stephen King is described as a writing machine, and Michael Jordan at the time that I was writing was, described as a dunking machine, right? You're a machine, right? Meanly fighting machine, but at the same time, a lot of times, if you describe somebody as a robot or an automaton, they can oftentimes mean something really bad. Like, I mean, anything from somebody who's really stiff and humorless to a political conformist. You have that was somebody completely lacking in independence in thought, and so what I became fascinated was that I mean in more simplistic books that dealt with this issue, they tend to emphasize one or the other. But I started tracing since the 18th century onwards the way in which Western culture will go back and forth, celebrating human beings and other living creatures as machines, and isn't that great? I mean, it's a description of efficiency and power and so on. But at the same time, in another context, people will be just absolutely horrified by the idea that, and this is his insistence that no, living beings are not machines, and that's precisely what makes living beings, and that spills over into other territories, like in political thought, right? Should we think of a society or government as a kind of machine, or is that what leads to tyranny, and so on, right? So in my book, I did a sort of longue durée study of, when I mean, I don't think there was ever an age where there was just sort of complete acceptance of one idea or the other, but the way in which that ambivalence, from celebration to abhorrence of the idea of human beings as machines just fluctuated, and why that happened in various different contexts. So my book, ranges over a long time. I like to joke that it covers the narrow time span between ancient Greece and 1920s.
Right.
Yeah, I can't go beyond that. That's too much, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, it was most fun going through all the references to human beings being described as machines throughout the ages, and see how the attitude toward that fluctuated from one period to another.
Yeah. No, as Jeremy and I both, as rhetorical scholars, we're very comfortable jumping from the ancient Greeks to the contemporary scene very quickly. So,
Yeah.
so you're in good company for that. Yeah, our very narrow focus is also a hugely broad 3,000-year focus. So, I guess sort of thinking about when you mentioned sort of all those references, what also struck us was and essentially kind of as something to talk about is your sort of mix of historical but also literary texts, right? So we were sort of interested in as part of our potential thinking through this is looking at what sort of corpus of materials do we draw on, and so the ways in which you sort of were able to sort of go back and forth and weave together both historical and literary texts. Sort of was that a function of where you were seeing these things show up, or was it also a function of your broader interests?
Yes. Well, it's sort of a thing that I've been thinking about creating a whole new methodology, or maybe a subfield altogether, that I'll call the history of the imagination, right? And in that methodology of history, I would in fact jump from one type of source to the other to try to get a comprehensive view of what a culture thought about an idea at some point, right? And to me, that was really one of the fun aspects of this job, the way in which you see that kind of language of, say, for instance, in the 18th century, the language of human beings as machines in scientific texts, like, for instance, in medical texts, where there was a medical mechanicism where they said that, to properly study the human body, you have to think about it as a machine. And then I examined the way in which that shows up in political theory, where the entire society is described as a human body. But what kind of a body? Well, the mechanical body, right? And so you go from medicine to political science, and then you see literary people when they are writing novels saying that, oh, that one character, he's like a machine, and that in some texts that's used as a compliment, because they said that, it's as display of efficiency and competence, and other instances where they go, that character is so humorless and stiff and incapable of independent thought, and he's like a machine, and so on, right? And I think for me, the methodology of the history of imagination consists of, doing exactly that, jumping from one type of the text to another and see how they influence each other, of these ideas that are floating around in the general culture that shows up in these very different genres of writing.
Yeah, no, I like that notion of how it circulates.
Mm.
And I guess that sort of leads to our next question. This is part of what our interest is, and it's in part something that I think that your book is helpful for too, is that one of our approaches is that we want to look how the Amazon's Mechanical Turk service is less, we're reading it less symptomatically, right? That it's responding to some cultural idea of the human, but we're interested in it as a technology, how it will shape our understanding of what the human is. And so in part, that's at least one of the ways that we're reading your book as well, is that it's how does the automaton itself, how does the machine itself influence the cultural imagination, as opposed to another reading that would simply see the machine as an artifact of culture as opposed to potentially an engine of it. And so that's kind of what we're interested in with how you've traced the automaton is essentially reading it less as a kind of, again, just I guess to repeat myself, an artifact of culture, but also driving the imagination, right? How people are responding to the machine and how the machine is something that they're using to describe or feel out the contours of what is human.
Right. Great. Yeah. That's and it's I mean the one of the problems is that I think we live in an age of specialization, right? And so even in my field, I think the usual advice you get in graduate school is that your primary goal, at least in the beginning of your career, is to stake out which of the small subfield that you're going to be in and try to become one of the leading scholars in that field, right? But so I unfortunately, given the kind of person I am, I just kind of completely ignored the advice and just did this very long duration study, which I wasn't supposed to do. But I think what you're pointing toward and is important, because in the age of specialization, that making of connections gets really lost. Connections through different periods, connections through different texts, and also connections between what's going on in the intellectual world and the larger culture, right? And in terms of view of humanity in connection with machinery and so on, right? So yeah, I mean, I think I hope that in the kind of research that you do, this approach of the history of the imagination will be very useful.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's why it's useful, because you can trace how these automatons or machines create this exigence in which people have to redefine the human. I mean, one of the ways at least when I was reading your book, that the ambivalence and the oscillation is, it's almost this, right, as people want to, or as a culture at large or a particular time period, right, needs to define the human, we oftentimes will do it in terms of exceptionalism, right? That what the human is uniquely good at. And then any time that a machine or automaton seems to get good at that, we then switch gears and say, well, actually, what we're really good at is this.
Yeah.
So I even like the ways that the vegetative became, right, that there's weird moments in which the human being's vegetable nature was celebrated because that was the opposite of the machine, right? That it turns out once machines get better at what we thought we were uniquely good at, we just switch gears and say, well, actually, that's not what's uniquely human. What's uniquely human is the vegetable. And the ways in which that those kind of things oscillate as human beings, at least our interest, right, as they carve out a definition of the human, in part, that's always a juxtaposition to some foil or something like that. So what's also one of the ways I was reading your book is that any time the automaton got good at something, human beings would sort of recalibrate the human to maintain that distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. And also that's on the side of the people who I mean, I don't want to say preconceived notion, but I mean, their ideology is based on the fact that there's always going to be a difference, right? That to be human is in fact not to be a machine. But I think in opposition to that, I think there's growing there's a group of thinkers who do think that we're machines, right? And that but the thing is, what changes is what kind of machines, right? So, like for instance, one of the things I examine in the course of my long duration study is that, I mean, throughout different periods from the Middle Ages onwards, when somebody uttered the word machine, what is likely to pop up in their head was completely different. And depending on what that is, and when they say that human beings are a machine, that would mean something completely different, right? I mean, just to give one example, I mean, you use the word machine in front of a typical 18th century person, and the first thing that person is likely to think is a clock. Right? And at that time, clocks are rather expensive, so only wealthy people could afford it. So it also tended to be really beautiful and intricate and unique and so on, right? But you go 100 years later and say, 1880s, and you say machine, the first thing that's likely to pop out in people's heads is a steam-driven, machine like a locomotive or a factory machine and so on, right? The connotation would be completely different, right? I mean, it's now huge, it's loud, it's dirty, and it's utilitarian, but at the same time, nightmarish in its, in some of its implications about its related to human beings. Right now, when you say machine now, as an analog to human beings, uh, we are, people of our age is unlikely to think either clock or a fact or steam-driven machines. We like to think of something like the computer,
Mhm.
which is again a completely different kind of entity. From steam-driven machine, locomotive, and a clock, right? And therefore, so as you said, not only does it change over time about how human beings are trying to distinguish themselves from machines, but even for those people who do believe that human beings are like machines, what kind of machines that they think it is also changes radically from one period to another.
Could I maybe ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
Because some of those and some of the examples you've addressed, they kind of perhaps attached to this notion of work or labor or doing something, right?
Mhm.
And for us, it's curious that the Mechanical Turk, it has this sort of strange space where, it is both a kind of trick,
Uh-huh.
but also, something that that the audience was ostensibly at least partially in on, right?
Uh-huh.
People weren't necessarily fooled that it was a chess playing robot so much as it was an impressive feat.
Uh-huh.
But at the same time, it not only, it brushed up against Veblen's, serious work in speech synthesis. And so these questions of, the machine's relationship and the human's relationship to productivity, but also things that are non-productive, right? I mean, chess is a game in a
Right.
sense.
Mhm.
So I'm kind of curious about that connection, using the machine as is it sort of tied to this notion of labor, or what's sort of the different factors that shifted into labor or recreation, or this kind of thing?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great question because that's also, that's also very much historically related. It would be of no surprise to anybody that the connection between the mechanization of humanity to labor, to work itself, I don't see a lot of that until the Industrial Revolution,
Hmm.
right? When machine is again, is associated so closely with mass labor and mass control of labor. Like for instance, in the 18th century, when I see, when I examined, the descriptions of human beings as machine, there's some labor aspects of it here and there, like in the encyclopedia and so on. But it's generally more of an intellectual exercise, right? Like as I pointed out, like doctors considering, is this the way to go to create a proper medical science to describe human beings as machines? But as you can imagine, for obvious reasons, like by the time you get to the mid 19th century, you cannot escape the labor element of it, right? Because again, now when people talk about use the word machine, they're no longer thinking of a beautiful, like gilded clock in the living room, right? They're thinking of these mass factories and locomotives and so on, right? And all of which are associated with labor, right? The thing with the Mechanical Turk, what I see is that, so that was presented first during the 1770s. So it's very much an 18th century Enlightenment form of entertainment. So when we're looking at the Turk and what it symbolized, we have to look at two completely separate things, which is one, what it meant when it was first displayed in the 18th century as a form of entertainment and so on, right? and then how in the 19th century it got completely reconfigured in terms of what it was supposed to represent, and the labor elements of it, comes in much later, including I forgot exactly what year. I mean, this could have been late 19th or early 20th century, but the American writer Ambrose Bierce
Mm.
wrote a short story called Moxons Master, and what's interesting, it's a story about a guy who's playing chess with a machine. That obviously is based on the Mechanical Turk, and the human beats the machine. At which point the machine reaches over and murders the human being. And this is, I think this story is very significant because that's the very first fictional story that I've ever come across where a machine intentionally kills a human being.
Hmm.
I mean, intentionally. There are other stories that are found earlier where it kills, and where a human being gets killed inadvertently by too close a contact with machines, but there's an intention. And one of the ways in which that story has been widely interpreted as a form of workers' rebellion, right? Because the story is Moxons Master, right, and so on, right? But that's in the post-industrial period. I mean, when I see how it was originally displayed in the 18th century, I don't see a lot of that. And the thing is, I mean, in your own research on the M-Turk, I don't know if this would be of any use to you, right? But but there was this. But what fascinates me about the Turk is that there are two great myths involved that needs to be demystified. One is something that you already mentioned, which is that a lot of people thought that it has been described as a fraudulent machine, and Wolfgang von Kempelen, who invented it, as a fraud, right? I really found no convincing evidence that. I mean, I'm sure there were a few gullible people, but I mean, this wasn't the Middle Ages. This was the 18th century, for God's sake, And I just don't see that many people at that time period actually thinking that this was an actual chess playing machine.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I mean, and one of the clear evidence was that Kempelen's friend Windisch, he wrote a sort of advertisement for the Turk, and he said, and this is for publicity, right, to attract attention to its display. And he actually used the word deception. Yes, this is a deception, right? I mean, it's almost like he was saying, of course, you and I, all of us know that this is not a real, chess playing machine. But the question is, how does it look like it's an actual chess playing machine, right? So it was a challenge, right? And as I said, I'm sure there were gullible people here and there who thought that this was a real thing. But in the same way that, I mean, today if we go to a magical performance, right, like David Copperfield and all that, there's an implicit understanding that this is illusions, right? And that doesn't even need to be said. I mean, no, people are going to praise David Copperfield for his capacity for creating illusions, and nobody's going to really seriously consider. I mean, is he an actual magician and so on, right? So that's one myth that needs to be demystified. But the other myth that I think that needs to be demystified is that it's actually not an automaton. I was actually slightly frustrated when Harvard University Press chose as the cover for my book a picture of the Mechanical Turk, right? Because in my book, I explicitly said that this is not an automaton, right? And it's only an automaton if it's a self-moving machine where there's no human being involved in it, that the mechanics of its device can move itself, right? But we now know that this wasn't a self-moving machine, that it was a device that hid a human being inside it. So it was a puppet. Right? And a puppet conceptually is a very different thing from an automaton, right? And I mean, the word automaton, for God's sakes, means a self-mover.
Right.
And yeah. But I mean, no, but when there are references to the Mechanical Turk here and there, like especially on the internet when they are mentioning here and there, that's two myths that are commonly described. They said this is a fraudulent object that fooled people into thinking that it was a chess playing machine, and that it was an automaton and all that. Neither of which is true, right? And I was wondering that in your research on the M-Turk, I wonder if that would be relevant. That this is actually not an I mean, they chose an object that's not an actual self-moving machine, and also it's not. Yeah. Right.
No, that's the gift. I mean, conceptually, they're calling it Mechanical Turk is sort of the gift that keeps on giving, because it's this. They've picked an object that sort of already starts to, critique or unpack itself.
Right.
The fact that one of the, I mean, they also refer to it as artificial intelligence. And so in part, the reason that we enjoy this and that we want to go, speak with you and go into the history of this is precisely those sort of competing myths, right? That we are in fact interested in the idea that everybody knows that this isn't just that in many ways, right? We like that those myths sort of collapse, and even demystifying them still leaves, right? Even that once you've demystified them, there's still lots of questions that still exist.
Right.
That in part, what we're also interested in is how hard it is to draw, like, the notion that anything is an automaton is interesting to us, right? The idea that is there actually something out there that's indeed self-moving as opposed to networked and connected, right? The idea that, in part, what your book traces, right, is even the notion of people's imaginations are not necessarily self-moving, but being shaped by the environment that's around them, right? So in many ways, we're kind of also interested in those moments where someone tries to define the human in some way, and oftentimes they'll come back to the human is what is uniquely autonomous.
The prime
But
mover.
all that, but there's still a cabinet in which something is inside doing something to something else, right? So the part of it we're interested in is the cabinet in which the difference between machinic and human agency gets muddled and hard to parse. And even when you know that it's an illusion, when you know that it's not fully autonomous, there still is there's still someone inside there that's using machines to make it work, right? There's also a sense in which the mechanical genius to pull off a fake machine is amazing, right? What still has to work in there, that to a certain extent, to simply say that the Mechanical Turk is reducible to the human chess player inside of it isn't true, right? Because there's a bunch of machines that person has to use in order to pull off the effect. So it's not as if once you open up the cabinet, you've now exposed who's doing what. There's still a nested relationship in there, right? So there's a sense in which I know there's a human being in there doing it. Yeah, but the human being is doing it through machinic means. And so you've not got the clean distinction you think you might get once you've opened up the cabinet, right? There's still what's the I now can't think of it, right? The pantograph, right? The piece that was being used to move the pieces.
Right.
The magnets that were in play to get the chess pieces to move there, right? It is still a machine. And so it's not the chess playing automaton isn't an automaton.
Right.
You probably can't but the person inside of it isn't also self-moving either, because they're only able to exert their autonomy through the machines that have been built by anyway. So that's in part, you're getting at precisely that those two myths, right? That it's a deception that's working and that it's not an automaton. The ways in which those play off each other is kind of what we're interested in. And Jeremy can probably speak to this too. What we're finding when we go in and look at the Mechanical Turk, the M-Turk, is that we look at some of these human intelligence tasks that are being written, and we don't know whether they're being written by bots or for bots. Once you get into these things, it becomes, again, as with the Mechanical Turk, right? We now find ourselves in the position of Edgar Allan Poe, trying to figure out how this thing works, because some of these jobs looks, even though they're ostensibly for humans, these tasks look very much like they're being written by bots and they're being accomplished by bots.
Yeah.
But it's hard to tell.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a sort of, almost Turing test, like, similarity here, that you look at some of these jobs and some of them are just kind of alphanumeric seeming gibberish. And it's, it's complicated because the pool is both human and non, right? But in terms of authorship, but also receivership. And it's, it's not quite clear. And I don't think we're interested necessarily in sort of reifying, well, here's a human and this one's a bot. And so here's how you can parse this up. It's more like, yeah, but they're operating in these shared spaces, right?
Right.
Where the notions of what's human and what's non, there's impingements and overlaps there that are meaningful.
Right. Yeah. I'm interested in whether the people who used the Turk to name this, they were aware of these complexities, right? Because you could say that, like, it's almost like von Kempelen's chess playing machine is almost like the Wizard of Oz. Right, except that unlike the Wizard of Oz, he wasn't, Kempelen wasn't trying to perpetrate a fraud, right? It's like, other people at Amazon realize that's, at the end of the day, it was as you said, it was mechanical genius, but at the end of the day, it was a human being in there, moving it. But there's a thing that I was interested in. There was one gesture that was made at the performances of the Turk that I found completely fascinating, and maybe this would also be relevant to to the M-Turk as well. The single most famous automaton builder of the 18th century was the Frenchman Jacques de Vaucanson, right? And he's the guy who, during the 1730s, started the whole automaton craze of the 18th century. And what he did was he created 3 true automata, right? And one was a human figure that played a flute, and it actually played a flute. It actually had wind coming out of its mouth and fingers moving. And there was a drummer, and the most famous of all, the duck.
Right.
Vaucanson's duck, right? It flapped its wings, it moved around, and then you put food in its mouth, and a couple of minutes later, stuff came out at the other end, right? And actually, that involved a fraud, an actual fraud, unlike Kempelen's chess playing machine that which wasn't a fraud. Von Kempelen claimed falsely that he actually created an entire digestive system for the duck, right? So that you put pellets in its mouth and it actually broke it down and feces came out, right? But that turned out to be not the case, right? He was just flat out lying when he said that, right? That in fact it was just a container with feces-looking pellets that released them and so on. But here's the thing: after an initial skepticism for his automata, thinking that those two were like kind of mechanical puppets, he proved them wrong by actually opening up these panels so that people could see the wheels and gears inside him move, and to prove that these were true automata, right? What's interesting is that when von Kempelen was displaying the chess playing machine, although nobody, people weren't believing that this was an actual chess playing machine, he did exactly the same thing, right? He opened up panels of the Turk, and there would be all these gears and so on that served no purpose.
Put the candle in there and
they were just there just to make people think that there was machinery inside when there was no machinery inside, right? No self-moving machinery inside, right? And that was just there to perpetuate the illusion, to tease people further with how this could have been done. So these were just completely ornamental gears and wheels that were just there to give the illusion that this was actually a fully functioning machine, right? So I wonder, like for MTurk, if there's sort of a similar kind of kind of what is it called? Magicians call it when you get the other person to pay attention to something else.
Misdirection.
Yeah, misdirection, right? I mean, is there misdirection involved in the MTurk as well?
I mean, the only thing I can think of is, given what we've seen, is that maybe the misdirection is. I mean, now we're talking about what's that movie, The Prestige, right? Where it's the layers upon layers, where they call it Mechanical Turk, so that what we think is happening is, oh well, they're paying attention to this notion that it's right, that we know there's a human behind it. They call it artificial intelligence. But I wonder if that's the misdirection, and it is in fact just bots all the way down, and that there's no right. It's the opposite, where they show you the human inside, but it's the human that's fake, and all the machinery is real.
Oh,
that would be potentially right if we wanted this nice symmetry between the Mechanical Turk, where you pull it open and it's fake machinery that hides the real human. That what Mechanical Turk does is show you a fake human to hide the actual algorithmic machinery that's right, which is one of the goals of Mechanical Turk, right? That machine learning, that a lot of the human intelligence tasks
are training
people do is they're training. Right. Every time you go to confirm your identity and you have to look at the pictures and say which one is the street sign in, you are training an algorithm or a bot to learn how to do that, so that one day they won't need that anymore. And so it's this not a flip, but it's that ambivalence you're talking about, where that if there is misdirection, it's the fake human that's hiding the real machinery.
Wow, that's a really interesting scenario, because that's like that's giving me an idea for a story in which you have like a Wizard of Oz situation where you pull back the curtain and there's a robot there. But a robot, right? And it's
back the curtain,
more terrifying.
Yeah,
you pull back the curtain. It's a man. You open the man's chest, and it's clockwork.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's maybe one of those where you pull back the curtain and it's just the Wizard of Oz. Like, it's just me. It's none of this is an illusion. It's actually just exactly what it is you think it is.
At which point Dorothy says, "Am I a machine?"
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Well, and we've been looking at that because there are these, and there are these interesting cusp cases where there was just recently a app service. It was you could go there, you could input specs for an application you want, and the pitch was it would, through machine learning, whip up a sort of rough version of your app. And it turned out what was mostly happening is it was just being exported to Indian engineers, as being exported to India. And so it was sort of a true Mechanical Turk in its its modern usage of its human layer being concealed by a veneer of algorithmic knowledge. But there is, in these spaces, what I think is kind of interesting there is the cases that aren't clear cut. Oh no, it's really this, because I think Mechanical Turk now is this entity where I think Amazon would be hard pressed to understand what it is, right? I mean, it's growing. I mean, to refer to that movie, The Prestige, at some point, the magician himself, Tesla himself, isn't quite sure what's going on, until they start to realize, this is working in ways we didn't really anticipate, and it's leading to outcomes like the strange sort of self-murder at the end of that movie, where
By the way, spoiler! We'll have to put a spoiler alert on this video.
Spoiler! If you haven't seen The Prestige, watch it. It's fascinating. But the outgrowths of this, because there's this secondary sort of layer of Turkers who have these channels where they communicate with each other, and they feed back about this requester is fair in the reward they give, or it takes this long to turn around. There are these weird sort of it grows beyond. It's as though the Mechanical Turk itself is doing things that the operator is like, how did it do that? right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have first of all, I have two thoughts about that. One is that, I mean, do you think you guys could find out who decided to use the Turk for that name and ask that person, what were you
Yeah.
thinking? And and the other thing is that, I mean, this, of course, we know that this is going to have real life consequences. I mean during I heard that during the last recession, one of the things that exacerbate the situation was that a lot of the investment companies had their computers set automatically to sell stocks when it hits a certain
Mhm.
level, right? Which speeded up everything so much that it's without human interventions, and that exacerbated the crash. And the more I read about it, the more I really think that, like, I think they should make that illegal. I
Well,
mean, because it has too many consequences for that, right? I mean, to make it, I mean, they should make it like mandatory that there has to be it has to go through, all sales should have to go through a human being,
yeah.
right? I mean,
Because
because we don't know. I mean, the consequences of this was so terrible, right?
yeah, no, and one of the things too is one of the original sort of responses to that, which is it's happening too quickly for human beings to understand.
To audit.
Yeah, but even after it was over, they
Yeah.
still haven't been able to make sense of it. Right?
Mm.
It's not
Right.
just that it's happening at a speed at which human beings can't keep up. It's even with the benefit of hindsight, they still haven't untangled what happened. Boy, now almost I think it was 2008, or there was another one too. I mean, it's been 10 years, and I think what you're getting at, it's not even the speed at which it's happening. It's that change in speed also does something qualitatively to what's happening. But
Mm.
yeah,
Right. Yeah. I
It's
mean, it might get into a situation where, I mean, that kind of automation causes a recession that would not have happened, or not as badly, because of certain settings and so on, right? I mean, yeah, I mean, it's like, I mean, it's just one of those cases where I think, a culture just sort of goes full speed with this technology without really properly thinking about its consequences. Even when there have already been consequences, they fail to, like, do anything about it.
yeah.
Right?
No, and there's lots of, I mean, sort of going back to literature, there's the science fiction author Charles Stross has a couple of these where human beings go out to make
Mhm.
contact with other aliens, and we send ourselves out, not actual physical beings, right? But we project ourselves, and we just run into spam. Just we just run into other cultures spam. So by the end, when one intelligent species meets another intelligent species, it's just actually our bots meeting their bots, and
Uh,
our bots trying to sell their bots, Viagra, and they're trying to sell, right. It's because that's all that, right, those things take over. So we don't make contact. It's just that there's one of his novels, I forget what it's called, but basically it's just what makes final contact out somewhere in space is just a series of phishing scams.
Right,
That's
right. Yeah, that's really funny. I've read Charles Stross's works, but I don't know that particular work. But when remember, like, a couple of months ago when they detected these radio signals, found in space, right? And
yeah.
I actually had the thought that the message that would come through would be something like, I'm a former galactic warlord, and
Yeah.
uh,
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
to regain my throne, but in the
right.
meantime, I need to hide my assets. So you give me your bank number and your social
Right.
security. You can
Yeah.
keep 10% of it.
No, I mean, I think that there's, yeah, that his extrapolation that's what will happen, given what you I think is a totally reasonable speculation about, it'll just be everybody, it'll just be intelligent species sending proof, proof to me you're not a robot.
Yeah, yeah,
And by that point, the robots will be able to click the box, and we won't, so.
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
Well, on that strange speculative note, yeah, again, or not again, I thanked you now again.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, because your book has not just been useful in terms of what we pulled from it, but also useful in terms of getting us to think about the the scope and the sort of the analogs for what we're looking for. And so being able to understand that it's that part of what, and that's what why your conclusion is also interesting for us too, is that it kind of, your book gets up to this moment where now when someone imagines a machine, they're imagining something computer, and even beyond that, right into they're imagining code or algorithms or bots. And so your book gives us a really helpful way to see where our project fits sort of historically, whereas we were imagining it as a much more sort of purely contemporary kind of project, and that there's actually this, right? So we were sort of had the same response you did, that sort of tongue-in-cheek way in which Amazon was using Turk, but that actually really getting into the history of the Mechanical Turk and its particular placement, I think gives us a much broader way of approaching this, and I think has given the project some depth that that we didn't know it needed.
Yeah, it's historical context. Yeah. It's lineage.
If I could mention one thing, I mean, the most recent thing that I've been working on in relation to what you were talking about the human-machine relationship is that, the theory of the Uncanny Valley has become hugely important in all kinds of cultures, and it was a idea that came out with the name escapes me, but he's a Japanese roboticist engineer. This was theory that came from all the way from the 1970s, and I see Uncanny Valley being mentioned all the time. It's just steeped into the larger culture. It is complete and utter bullshit. Because I read the essay very carefully, and it's not what people think it is. And it's and for roboticists, it has been completely debunked. So I'm actually for the Modern Language Association meeting, I'm actually going to give a talk about it's called Debunking the Uncanny Valley. But to me, it's really interesting case of because one of the things I want to look at is why it has become so popular. It just seems like people who use it all the time haven't really read the essay very carefully. But I think it goes into the kind of things that they'll. The thing is, I think it's gotten popular because it seems to do what the essay never really does, which is to provide an explanation for why we get creeped out by machines.
Right.
But you examine what he's saying, and the whole thing doesn't make any sense. And so there needs to be a completely different reconfiguration of this, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my essential message for this talk, right? Uncanny Valley is bullshit.
That's good. I like a provocative takeaway. That will certainly help in the marketing of this conversation, right?
Definitely.
We interviewed a historian to talk about the Mechanical Turk, but what he says about the Uncanny Valley, you won't believe. And now we have our clickbait.
That's the slug line right there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that will be interesting to hear about that.
Yes, and thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, you're very welcome. This is great. Yeah.
All right, and we'll hopefully keep in contact.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in the same area, so. Yeah.
Yes, I know. It's right down the road. Okay. Well, enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah, excellent. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.